I was told the island didn't exist. No coordinates, no name. Just a blank stretch of water circled in red grease pencil on a classified naval chart. They said we were going in for reconnaissance, nothing more. Verify rumors, confirm terrain, extract quietly. But the first thing I saw wasn't jungle or shoreline. It was bones. Bleached white, tangled in vines, wrapped around rusted weapons that predated our war by centuries. The locals called it Snake Island. Not because of what lived there, but because of what guarded what was buried beneath it. We weren't the first soldiers sent there. We were just the first ones ordered to bring something back. And from the moment my boots touched that sand, I knew the treasure wasn't gold. It was a warning. Welcome to Combat Lore Files, where the shadows of war live on. Hit subscribe and get nightly drops of stories like this. Some missions arrive with coordinates. This one arrived with erasures. I didn't know the island's name when they slid the folder across the steel table. That absence pressed heavier than any classified stamp I'd seen before. The briefing room smelled like burnt coffee, old paper, and ozone from the projector humming behind us. The lights were dimmed, not for secrecy, but habit. Dark rooms make men ask fewer questions. I was a naval reconnaissance scout, trained for quiet coastlines, denied beaches, and places command wanted eyes on without admitting they existed. My uniform was still damp with salt from the last patrol, boots scuffed, hands steady in a way that only comes after you've stopped believing missions end clean. The officer across from me didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. His rank pins were enough, and his eyes never left the folder, like even looking at me too long might contaminate the room. Inside the folder were charts. Not maps, charts. The difference mattered. Maps explain land. Charts avoid it. The coastline was there in faint contour lines, but the center was deliberately washed out, like someone had scrubbed the paper with solvent. There was a red grease pencil circle floating in empty blue, no name, no latitude, no longitude, just a note in block letters. Verify. Rumors. Unconfirmed. The projector clicked on, throwing grainy black and white images onto the wall. Aerial shots taken from altitude, clouds half obscuring a dark smudge of land. Technically, nothing remarkable. Just another island among thousands scattered across contested waters. But the way the images skipped, the way frames were missing, told me this wasn't reconnaissance. It was recovery. Shipping losses, the officer said flatly, as if reading weather data. Unlogged disappearances, dating back decades. He didn't specify which decades. That omission was another warning sign. The images shifted to old photographs, steamships from the early 20th century, convoy vessels from the war years, modern freighters. All different eras, all same outcome. Last known positions clustered around that empty circle. My stomach tightened the way it always did when timelines overlapped like that. History doesn't stack neatly unless something is pulling it together. I asked the obvious question. Why recon? The officer finally looked up. His eyes were tired, not afraid, which somehow felt worse. Because every asset sent to verify hasn't returned with usable data. Not hasn't returned. He chose his words carefully. That meant some came back. Bodies or survivors. Both were bad possibilities. The room felt smaller then, air stale, projector fan whining like an insect trapped in glass. I glanced at the other men selected for the team. Seasoned faces. No rookies. That told me command expected resistance, not terrain. We were given loadouts heavy on sensors and light on firepower, another contradiction. If you expect a fight, you bring guns. If you expect something else, you bring instruments. The charts showed no defensive installations, no radar signatures, no heat blooms, no reason for silence. But silence has weight when it's deliberate. I traced the circle with my finger, the waxy residue smearing slightly under my skin. That circle wasn't drawn to mark danger, it was drawn to contain it. The officer slid a final page across, an intelligence summary thin enough to be insulting. Local reports, missing fishermen. Legends mentioned only in footnotes and dismissed immediately after being recorded. The word snakes appeared twice, each time crossed out and replaced with fauna anomaly. I'd seen that trick before. Replace a word so nobody has to imagine it. We were ordered to deploy at night. Low visibility insertion, no radio chatter beyond encrypted burst transmissions. Extract after 48 hours or upon confirmation of objective. Command didn't define the objective beyond verification of site significance. That phrase echoed in my head as we left the room. Site significance wasn't a military term. It belonged to archaeologists and priests. I packed my gear in silence, the familiar ritual grounding me. Magazines checked, batteries sealed, knife strapped where muscle memory could find it in the dark. As I worked, I felt that old pressure behind my eyes, the sense that this mission wasn't about enemies. It was about witnesses. We boarded the transport before dawn. The sea was calm, deceptively so, a flat sheet of black glass reflecting no stars. The engines thumped low and steady, a sound that usually soothed me. This time it felt like a countdown. The coxswain didn't speak. The crew avoided looking at the charts taped near the console, as if acknowledging the destination might invite it closer. As we pushed off, my radio crackled once with static, then went silent. Not dead, just quiet. That distinction mattered too. Hours passed without incident, but the atmosphere shifted as we crossed an invisible line. The air cooled abruptly, breath fogging despite the tropical latitude. The smell changed too, from salt and diesel to something older, damp like soil that hadn't seen daylight in centuries. The compass needle wavered, then steadied, then wavered again. No alarms, no warnings, just subtle wrongness. The kind you feel in your bones before your brain catches up. I checked the GPS. It blinked, recalculated, then displayed coordinates that didn't match anything on our charts. The coxswain muttered under his breath and powered down the screen. We navigated the last stretch manually, guided by a shoreline we could barely see through creeping fog. The island rose out of the mist without ceremony. No dramatic cliffs, no welcoming beach, just a dark mass of jungle pressed tight against the waterline. Trees leaned inward, branches tangled like they were conspiring. The surf made almost no sound, waves dying against the sand instead of breaking. That silence wrapped around us, thick and intentional. I'd landed on hostile shores before, under fire, with flares painting the night red. This was worse. There was no opposition to focus on, no immediate threat to catalog. Only the feeling that we'd arrived somewhere uninvited. As we drifted closer, my night vision caught shapes along the tree line. Not movement. Shadows too dense, too deliberate to be foliage alone. I blinked, adjusted focus, and they were gone. My hands tightened on my rifle despite orders to keep weapons slung. The boat scraped sand softly, a sound that felt amplified in the stillness. We disembarked without a word. Boots sank into wet sand, littered with fragments, shells, driftwood, and something that made my stomach lurch when my light brushed over it. Bone, white and smooth. Not fish, not small. I turned my beam away instinctively, heart hammering. The jungle exhaled, a low rustling sigh that raised the hair on my arms. Behind us, the sea lay unnaturally flat, reflecting the island like a mirror that refused to distort the truth. I realized then that the charts hadn't omitted the island because it was unknown. They'd omitted it because naming it would make it real. And standing there, salt drying on my skin, sweat cooling too fast, I understood something else just as clearly. This mission wasn't about discovering what was on that island. It was about confirming whether it was still hungry. The sea grew quiet as we approached the coordinates they swore didn't exist. There are places men refuse to name because names invite answers. We didn't sail straight for the island. After the briefing and before the insertion, Command rotated us through a coastal stretch dotted with fishing villages that barely registered on modern charts. The official reason was resupply and weather confirmation. The real reason, I realized later, was deniability. If anything went wrong, we were never meant to be remembered passing through. I remember the village because it smelled of drying nets, brine, and wood smoke, a scent that carried history heavier than any archive. The huts stood on stilts above tidal mud, roofs patched with corrugated metal and palm thatch, every surface worn smooth by salt and hands that had repeated the same motions for generations. Children watched us from behind doorways, silent, eyes too old for their faces. When soldiers arrive unannounced, even in peacetime, people learn quickly whether to stare or hide. Here, they did both. Our uniforms marked us as foreign before we spoke, but it was the equipment that changed the air. Night optics, sealed packs, weapons wrapped tight against moisture, tools meant for places where rescue doesn't come. The village headman approached last, moving slowly, leaning on a stick polished to a dull shine. His hair was white, skin darkened like cured leather, eyes sharp and measuring. He spoke little English, but language wasn't the real barrier. When our interpreter asked about islands offshore, the old man didn't answer. He looked past us instead toward the water, as if checking whether the sea itself was listening. We tried maps first. Standard procedure. Fishermen know coastlines better than any admiral. The interpreter pointed to the blank stretch of chart the empty space command insisted was nothing. The old man's mouth tightened. He shook his head once, slow and final. Then he took the map and turned it over as if the answer might be on the back. When he handed it back, his fingers lingered on the paper, tracing a circle in the air that matched the one I'd seen in grease pencil days earlier. That gesture chilled me more than words could have. Others gathered then, elders mostly, faces lined deep by sun and years. A woman pressed a charm into the interpreter's hand without explanation, woven fiber threaded with small bones and bits of shell. The interpreter hesitated before translating their murmurs. They didn't speak directly. They never said island. They said there. They said the place that coils. They said the ground that remembers. Each phrase came with the same warning tone I'd heard from veterans talking about ambush valleys and cursed roads in other wars. Places where men vanished and the land kept the secret. When pressed, one of the elders finally spoke a single word that cut through the murmuring like a blade. The interpreter swallowed before repeating it. Serpents, not snakes, not animals. Serpents. The distinction mattered. The elder's hands moved as he spoke, fingers weaving through the air in slow, deliberate motions, spiraling inward, then tightening. He pointed to his temple, then his chest, then the sea. The story, as fragmented as it was, came together in pieces. An island older than memory. A place where ships came seeking shelter, water or wealth, and never returned. Gold taken from wrecks. The dead left unburied, the land itself offended. I asked about storms, reefs, currents, anything rational to anchor the fear. The elder shook his head. No storms, no rocks, no tide strong enough to drag iron under. The sea, he insisted, was calm there. That was the danger. Calm enough to invite you close. Calm enough to make you careless. He mimed a ship gliding in, sails full, then his hands snapped shut together, fingers interlocking like jaws. What struck me wasn't the superstition. It was the consistency. Every elder, every whisper circled the same idea, that the island wasn't cursed because of serpents. The serpents were there because of what men had done. The interpreter hesitated again before translating the last part. They believe the island was claimed, not discovered, not inhabited. Claimed. As if it were a living thing that had chosen guardians. I noticed then that no boats were pulled up on the beach facing that direction. Their bows angled away, nets stacked to block sight lines, as if even looking too long might draw attention. One fisherman, younger than the others, met my gaze briefly. His eyes widened in recognition, not of me, but of my intention. He shook his head once, sharp and urgent, then looked down as if ashamed for even acknowledging the thought. Command dismissed the village accounts as folklore when we relayed them through channels. That was expected. Folklore is convenient. It absorbs fear and lets planners pretend they're immune. But standing there, boots sinking into mud older than any nation, I felt the weight of something unrecorded. These people weren't afraid of being attacked. They were afraid of being noticed. The difference gnawed at me. Before we left, the old headman approached again. He didn't offer supplies. He didn't ask for payment. He simply touched 2 fingers to my wrist, feeling my pulse, then drew a slow circle over my forearm, pressing hard enough to hurt. His eyes never left mine. When he spoke, the interpreter translated quietly, almost reverently. "If you take from it," he said, "do not bring it back to the water." I asked what he meant. He released my arm and stepped back, shaking his head. The conversation was over. Some warnings aren't meant to be clarified. They're meant to linger. We pushed off before dusk. The village shrank behind us, silhouettes against the fading light. No one waved. No one watched once we were far enough out. They turned their backs as a group, a gesture that felt ceremonial, like closing a door. The sea took on a different character the farther we went, losing its familiar rhythm. The engine noise seemed too loud, echoing where it shouldn't. I kept thinking about the word claimed. In military terms, to claim ground is to occupy it, to mark it, to defend it. But the elders spoke of it like a pact or a sentence. As night fell, the stars dimmed behind thin cloud, and the horizon blurred until sky and water merged. The island lay ahead somewhere in that darkness, unnamed, unmarked, yet deeply known by those who survived near it. I realized then that maps aren't just tools. They're agreements, mutual understandings between men and land. This place had refused the agreement. And as the boat cut steadily toward that quiet stretch of sea, I understood why the elders wouldn't name it. Legends didn't concern command, but the silence in those men's eyes followed us offshore. The jungle didn't greet us. It assessed us. The moment we crossed the tree line, the island changed character. The beach had been quiet, almost sterile, but the jungle swallowed sound in a way I'd never experienced before. No insects, no birds, no distant surf. Just the faint creak of branches under their own weight and the soft compression of wet earth beneath our boots. It felt less like entering terrain and more like stepping into a held breath. Our training taught us how to read jungles, how to listen for life, how to map movement by sound. This place gave us nothing to read, and that absence gnawed at me harder than gunfire ever had. We advanced in staggered formation, spacing tight, weapons still slung per orders, but hands never far. The canopy above us knitted together so thickly that daylight filtered down in dull green bands, turning every face sickly and indistinct. Sweat started immediately, soaking through fabric, carrying the smell of metal and salt with it. The air was heavy, pressing against the lungs, but not oppressive, more like expectant, as if the jungle itself was waiting for something specific to happen. I checked my instruments. Temperature normal, humidity high, no anomalies recorded, and yet every step felt observed. The first sign wasn't dramatic. We nearly walked past it. A machete blade half buried in the soil, rusted to a deep brown, handle rotted away. It was old, colonial era, judging by the shape and steel. Work tool, not weapon. Someone had cleared ground here long before us, hacking a path that nature had since reclaimed. The blade hadn't snapped. It had been placed there, edge down, like a marker. No remains nearby. No campsite. That unsettled me more than if we'd found a body. Tools abandoned usually mean panic. This felt deliberate. 10 meters farther in, we found boots. Blackened leather, soles separating, laces fossilized by mud. They weren't military issue, I recognized, but they were modern enough to tell a story. Someone had walked in recently enough for their gear to last, and they hadn't walked back out. The ground around the boots showed no sign of struggle, no drag marks, no scattered equipment, just stillness, as if the owner had stepped out of them willingly and never returned. As we pushed deeper, the artifacts multiplied. A rusted Enfield rifle propped against a tree, barrel bent slightly as if exposed to heat. Old webbing tangled in vines, canvas eaten away but brass fittings gleaming faintly through the green. A helmet from the last war, split cleanly down one side, hanging from a branch by its chin strap. I recognized that one. I'd trained with instructors who wore versions of it when they were young. That connection sent a cold ripple through my gut. This island wasn't selective. It took from every era equally. Then we found the bones. They weren't scattered the way remains usually are after time and scavengers. They were arranged, long bones stacked parallel, skulls placed facing inward, eye sockets dark and empty, jaws slack. Some were human, others were not, too large, too elongated, vertebrae thicker than they should have been for anything native we'd been briefed on. There were no teeth marks, no signs of feeding. These weren't leftovers. They were exhibits. No one spoke. We didn't need to. The jungle seemed closer here, branches arching overhead, roots breaking through the soil like grasping fingers. I felt a prickle at the base of my neck, that primitive warning that predates language. I scanned the shadows between trunks, night vision painting everything in grainy green, but saw no movement. Still, the sense of being watched intensified, pressing in from all directions at once. The first skin appeared draped over a low branch, catching light like wet parchment. At first glance, I thought it was tarp or netting left behind by fishermen. Then I saw the pattern. The scales were intact, translucent, larger than my hand, and perfectly shed in one piece. It was a snake skin, but far larger than any I'd encountered in training or deployment. It stretched longer than a man is tall, tapering into the undergrowth. The head section had been carefully flattened and nailed to the tree with wooden spikes driven deep into the bark. The craftsmanship was intentional, the message unmistakable. More skins followed. As we advanced, they appeared at regular intervals, always facing inward toward the path, never outward, nailed at eye level, hung high between branches, laid across fallen logs like barriers. Some were fresh, still faintly iridescent. Others had yellowed and split with age, edges curling like old paper. That meant one thing. This wasn't a single event. This was maintenance. My mind tried to rationalize it. Territorial markers, exaggerated fauna, misinterpreted local rituals. But each explanation fell apart under scrutiny. Animals don't arrange warnings. Humans don't leave treasures and bones without motive. And whatever had shed these skins had done so repeatedly, comfortably, in the same territory for longer than any record we carried. Our point man froze suddenly, fist raised. We halted instantly, training snapping us into silence. He pointed to the ground ahead. At first, I saw nothing. Then, the pattern emerged. The soil had been disturbed, but not by footsteps. No heel impressions, no tread marks. Instead, there were smooth, sinuous grooves pressed into the mud, overlapping, intersecting, layered atop one another like the tracks of something that moved without limbs. Some were as wide as my forearm, others thicker than my thigh. They circled our path, converging and diverging in lazy arcs, as if whatever made them had taken its time. I knelt to examine them. The edges were crisp. That meant recent. Moisture still clung to the depressions, undisturbed by rain or insects. My gloves came away slick with mud, and something else, a faint, musky odor that didn't belong to plants or rot. It reminded me of old leather left in the sun, mixed with copper. The smell of scales warming after a shed. We adjusted formation without speaking, spacing tighter, backs closer. The jungle seemed to lean in response, branches creaking softly, leaves brushing against gear where moments before there had been space. My radio hissed with low static, then cleared, then hissed again. No voices, no signals, just interference localized to our position. I tapped the casing once, hard, like it might respond to discipline. It didn't. We reached what might once have been a clearing, now choked by regrowth. In its center stood something that didn't belong there. A crude altar of stacked stone, blackened by age and smoke. On it lay objects from different centuries laid side by side. A gold coin stamped with a forgotten crest, a rusted dog tag, a compass frozen mid-spin, its glass cracked but intact. No offerings of food, no idols, just proof. That was when the realization settled in, heavy and undeniable. This island wasn't hiding what it had taken. It was cataloging it. I felt a pressure in my chest then, not panic, but recognition, the way you feel when a truth finally catches up to you. We weren't explorers. We weren't even intruders. We were entries waiting to be recorded. The jungle's silence made sense now. It wasn't empty. It was attentive. As daylight thinned under the canopy, shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching in directions the sun didn't justify. The temperature dipped, sweat cooling too fast on skin. We established a temporary perimeter near the clearing, sensors placed, eyes outward, breath controlled. No one complained. No one joked. The island had stripped that instinct from us with quiet efficiency. Somewhere beyond our sight, something shifted. Branches flexed, not snapped. Flexed, with weight. And then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of scales moving against bark, slow and deliberate, circling. By nightfall, the jungle began to breathe, and something began moving around our perimeter. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't need to. Night didn't fall on the island so much as it settled, thick and deliberate, like a lid being placed over us. The last traces of filtered daylight vanished beneath the canopy, replaced by a darkness that felt measured, controlled. Our perimeter sensors stayed silent. No alarms, no alerts. That was the first sign something was wrong. Whatever moved around us wasn't careless enough to trip them. We crouched low, backs to roots and stone, listening to a jungle that had finally found its voice. Not with noise, but with intent. The sound came again. Slow. Scale against bark. Not a rush. Not a slither. The controlled drag of weight being shifted with purpose. It circled us wide at first, just outside the reach of our lights, testing distance, mapping reaction time. I'd been stalked before, by men, by animals driven by hunger or fear. This was different. There was no urgency in it, no aggression. It moved us like it already owned the ground beneath us. I caught the first full glimpse when my night vision swept too far left. The image froze in my mind even as my hand trembled. A massive coil looped around the trunk of a tree, thicker than a truck tire. The scales were matte, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, patterned in muted earth tones that blended perfectly with shadow and bark. The body didn't tense when my beam touched it. It didn't react at all. The head rested higher, elevated with unsettling grace, eyes open, unblinking, fixed not on my weapon, but on my face. That's when I knew it wasn't hunting. It was observing. More shapes revealed themselves as our lights shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, like pieces of a puzzle we hadn't realized we were assembling. One serpent lay stretched along a fallen log, body draped as if it had always been part of the forest floor. Another was coiled in the branches overhead, its length distributed so evenly it looked like a natural extension of the tree. They weren't crowding us. They were positioned, with lines of sight, covering exits. No one fired. Training held us back, but so did something else. An instinct older than doctrine that whispered shooting would only prove we didn't understand the rules. The serpents were enormous, far beyond any species catalogued in our briefings, yet nothing about them felt monstrous. There was intelligence in their stillness, in the way their heads angled slightly as different team members shifted weight or adjusted posture. They tracked us individually. The myths surfaced then, unbidden. The elders' gestures, the spiral motion, the word claimed. These weren't predators defending territory. They were wardens enforcing terms. That realization didn't calm me. It tightened something deep in my chest. If this place had rules, we had already broken them by entering armed and uninvited. The attack, if it could even be called that, came without warning. No hiss, no strike. The man on our right flank stiffened mid-breath, eyes widening as if he'd just understood something too late. A coil unwrapped itself from the darkness behind him, smooth and impossibly fast, looping once around his torso, pinning his arms before any of us could react. His radio crackled sharply as pressure collapsed his chest. He didn't scream. He didn't even grunt. The sound that escaped him was small, surprised, and then cut off entirely. We moved then, too late, too slow. Weapons came up, lights flared, voices shouted commands that echoed uselessly off bark and stone. The serpent holding him didn't constrict violently. It tightened just enough. The man went limp in seconds, consciousness stolen before pain could register. The serpent's head rose close to his face, tongue flicking once, tasting, confirming. Then the body flowed backward, dragging him with it, disappearing into foliage that closed behind them like water disturbed briefly by a passing hand. No blood. No struggle. No trace left behind beyond crushed leaves and a faint groove in the soil. Shock threatened to break discipline, but fear held it together. We tightened formation instinctively, backs nearly touching now, lights overlapping in frantic arcs. The serpents didn't retreat. They adjusted. One shifted higher into the branches. Another repositioned along the ground, blocking the direction our teammate had been taken. They weren't reacting emotionally. They were correcting an imbalance. I realized then that the earlier bones, the arranged remains, the artifacts from different eras, it wasn't slaughter. It was enforcement. Those who resisted, who tried to take, were removed cleanly. The island didn't need chaos. It needed compliance. Our leader whispered orders, voice low and steady despite the circumstances. Fall back slowly. No pursuit. No firing unless directly engaged. The words tasted hollow. Direct engagement had just been redefined. The serpents parted for us as we moved, not stepping aside but allowing passage the way guards open a gate for someone whose time hasn't yet expired. That courtesy terrified me more than hostility would have. As we retreated, I noticed markings along the serpents' bodies that hadn't registered before. Scar lines. Old, pale seams where scales had once been damaged and regrown. Not random injuries. Patterned ones. Straight cuts. Burns. Circular indentations like musket balls flattened against living armor. These creatures had been attacked before. By blades. By bullets. By fire. And they were still here. That meant something else hadn't survived the encounter. We regrouped near the stone structure we'd found earlier, breathing controlled, hearts pounding so loudly I was sure the serpents could hear them. No one spoke the name of the man we'd lost. Saying it felt like another provocation. I stared at the objects on the altar again, suddenly understanding their arrangement. They weren't trophies. They were receipts. Proof of attempts made and debts paid. One serpent moved closer then, head lowering until its eyes were level with mine. There was no threat posture, no flared hood, no open mouth, just attention. I felt exposed in a way body armor couldn't prevent. The creature's gaze felt measured, as if weighing intention rather than action. I thought of the Elder's warning about taking things back to the water. I wondered how many before us had ignored similar advice, convinced superiority or firepower made them exempt. The serpent withdrew slowly, rejoining the others, and a subtle shift rippled through the jungle. Branches relaxed, leaves rustled. The sense of pressure eased just enough for me to realize how tightly it had been held. We were being allowed to remain, for now. That knowledge settled over us like a sentence deferred, not lifted. We adjusted our route away from the clearing, deeper inland, despite every instinct screaming to head back to the beach. Command wanted verification. We had just received it in the most direct way possible. But orders don't dissolve easily, and neither does curiosity when it's mixed with dread. As we moved, the serpents followed at a distance, always present, always aware, their silence louder than gunfire. I stopped thinking of them as animals entirely. They didn't behave like creatures driven by hunger or territory. They behaved like sentinels bound to something older than us, older than the wars that had brought so many men to these shores. They weren't guarding treasure for its value. They were guarding it because it represented a test humanity kept failing. The deeper we pushed inland, the clearer it became. We weren't being hunted. We were being judged. Some doors aren't hidden to keep you out. They're buried to keep something in. We found the chamber because the jungle changed again. Not abruptly, not violently, but with the same deliberate restraint it had shown since our arrival. The ground sloped downward beneath a tangle of roots so thick they braided together like muscle and bone. Tree trunks rose from the earth at impossible angles, fed by something deep below, their roots bursting through the soil in massive ridges that forced us to climb rather than walk. The air grew cooler there, damp in a way that felt subterranean rather than coastal. I could smell stone beneath the rot and green, the mineral scent of something sealed away from light. Our instruments flickered as we approached, readings flattening out as if overwhelmed. The serpents were still with us, though we couldn't see them directly anymore. I felt their presence in the way branches shifted just out of sight, in the way shadows settled into watchful shapes between roots. No pressure, no aggression, just allowance. They were letting us continue. That terrified me more than resistance would have. The entrance revealed itself slowly, the way old wounds do when disturbed by weather. A narrow gap between roots widened as we cleared vines and leaf litter, revealing worked stone beneath. Not crude, not natural. Smooth slabs fitted together with a precision that hadn't eroded despite centuries of moisture and growth. The stone was dark, almost black, etched with shallow grooves that spiraled inward in repeating patterns. I recognized the shape instantly, though I couldn't explain how. It was the same motion the elders' hands had made in the air, the same geometry the serpents traced when they moved. This wasn't a ruin built on the island. It was built into it. We cleared just enough to slip inside one at a time. The passage sloped downward sharply, walls slick with condensation that reflected our lights in dull halos. The ceiling pressed low, forcing us to crouch, gear scraping stone with a sound that felt sacrilegious in the quiet. My breathing sounded too loud in my ears, each exhale fogging briefly before vanishing. We descended slowly, counting steps, marking distance out of habit more than necessity. There was no way extraction teams would ever come this deep if something went wrong. The chamber opened suddenly, space expanding in a way that made my stomach lurch. We stepped into a cavernous room supported by thick stone pillars fused with tree roots that had broken through the ceiling over centuries, growing downward like inverted trunks. The roots wrapped around the architecture, rather than destroying it, as if respecting boundaries laid down long before the trees themselves had sprouted. Bioluminescent fungus clung to the stone in pale blue clusters, casting a ghostly glow that softened the harsh beams of our lights. At the center of the chamber lay the treasure. It wasn't piled chaotically the way looters leave things. It was arranged with reverence, or perhaps judgment. Gold coins stacked in careful columns, their stamps worn but recognizable from empires long collapsed. Ingots bearing unfamiliar marks set beside them, edges smoothed by handling rather than age. Jewelry lay coiled like resting serpents themselves, gemstones dulled by time but intact. Weapons rested nearby, each separated by era and type. Bronze blades with leaf-shaped edges, colonial sabers etched with names and dates, rifles from successive wars laid side by side, magazines removed, chambers empty, all of it clean. No corrosion, no decay beyond what time alone would demand. This wasn't a hoard. This was an archive. I moved closer, drawn despite myself, boots echoing softly on stone that hadn't known footsteps in lifetimes. I knelt near a stack of coins, gloved fingers hovering just above them. I could feel something then, not heat, not vibration, but a pressure like standing too close to a sleeping animal. The objects felt aware, not alive, but significant in a way modern words struggle to capture. Each piece carried the weight of the hand that had tried to claim it, the intent that had brought it here. We found markings along the walls then, partially obscured by roots and mineral growth. Carvings depicting ships arriving, men unloading cargo, hands reaching toward glittering shapes beneath stylized serpents. The final panels showed those same men leaving empty-handed, or not leaving at all, bodies coiled beneath massive forms that watched without expression. It wasn't propaganda, it wasn't warning, it was record-keeping. The realization settled in, heavy and undeniable. This chamber wasn't created to protect treasure from thieves. The treasure existed to lure thieves here, to test them, to see what they would do when faced with wealth unguarded by walls or armies. The serpents weren't defending riches, they were enforcing consequence. Our leader relayed fragments of what we saw back to command in coded bursts, voice controlled but strained. Command's response came back clipped and immediate. Confirm recoverable artifacts. Extract samples for verification. That was it. No questions about context. No concern for what maintaining balance might mean. The old logic asserted itself. Control what you can. Document the rest. Learning never survives contact with authority. We debated quietly, voices low, every word feeling like it might tip unseen scales. Some argued for compliance. Take something small, A coin, a blade, proof to justify the risk and losses already incurred. Others, myself included, felt a deep, instinctive resistance. The elder's words echoed in my head. Do not bring it back to the water. I understood now that the warning wasn't superstition. It was instruction. I noticed then that none of the artifacts crossed a certain boundary. An invisible line etched subtly into the floor, a shallow groove circling the central collection. Every object rested within it, none beyond. That boundary wasn't decorative. It was a limit, a rule, and rules only exist where something enforces them. The serpents made themselves known again without entering the chamber. Their shadows slid across the entrance, massive shapes blocking and revealing the passage in slow rhythm. I could feel their attention sharpen, not hostile, but focused. They were waiting to see what choice we would make. The test had reached its critical moment. Against my better judgment, against every warning clawing at my mind, command's authority carried weight even here. Our leader reached forward, hesitating only a second, and lifted a small old object from the pile. It was heavier than expected. Ancient craftsmanship pressed warm against his glove despite the cool air. The moment it crossed the boundary, the chamber reacted. The bioluminescent glow dimmed noticeably, retreating toward the walls. The air thickened, pressure building like an approaching storm. My ears popped softly. The roots overhead creaked, tightening their grip on stone. A low vibration thrummed through the floor, felt more than heard, like a warning growl from the island itself. The serpents outside shifted, their movements no longer fluid but tense, coils drawing tighter. No one spoke. We didn't need to. The message was clear. This place tolerated observation. It permitted understanding. What it did not allow was removal. The object in my teammate's hand felt suddenly obscene, like a stolen relic ripped from a grave. I could see it in his eyes too, the dawning realization that the weight he felt wasn't gold. It was debt. He lowered the artifact back into its place carefully, almost reverently. The pressure eased, not instantly but gradually, like a held breath finally released. Light returned to the fungus. Roots relaxed their grip. The serpent's shadows withdrew just enough to remind us that restraint had been noted. We stood there longer than necessary, absorbing the truth carved into stone and consequence. The treasure wasn't meant to enrich anyone. It existed to expose something fundamental about us. The willingness to take when offered. The belief that presence equals permission. That history resets with each new uniform and flag. As we prepared to leave the chamber, moving backward without turning our backs, I felt a profound sense of trespass. Not because we had entered, but because we had been trusted with a choice and nearly failed it. Removing even one artifact felt like breaking a seal that had held for centuries. The island did not rage. It corrected. The order came through in a burst transmission so short it felt unreal. Extract proof. Confirm possession. Prepare for immediate withdrawal. Command's voice was calm, insulated by distance and authority, stripped of everything we had just witnessed beneath the roots. They hadn't felt the pressure change. They hadn't watched the light retreat. They hadn't seen the serpents tighten like drawn wires. They heard treasure and translated it into leverage. I knew then the decision had already been made somewhere far from this place, by people who would never smell the damp stone or feel the ground listening beneath their boots. Our leader hesitated only a moment before acknowledging. The hesitation mattered more than the compliance. He chose a different artifact this time, smaller, easier to justify. A coin. A single piece, lifted carefully from the center of the chamber. As it left the boundary line etched in stone, the island responded immediately and without ambiguity. There was no gradual warning this time. No subtle pressure. The reaction was violent, absolute. The ground convulsed beneath us, a deep rolling force that knocked us off balance. Roots tore free from the ceiling with cracking sounds like splitting bone. Stone dust rained down, choking the air. The bioluminescent glow died completely, plunging the chamber into harsh artificial light that felt exposed and wrong. My ears filled with a low-frequency roar that wasn't sound so much as vibration, shaking teeth and gear alike. The serpents outside announced themselves at last, not with hisses or strikes, but with movement on a scale the jungle itself couldn't contain. They came through the entrance in coordinated waves, bodies uncoiling from shadows, forcing their way through gaps that should not have accommodated their size. Branches shattered. Roots snapped. Tree trunks groaned as weight shifted and rebalanced with terrifying precision. These were not animals lashing out. They were enforcers, executing a judgment that had already been decided. The first man died without understanding why. He turned to run as the chamber destabilized, slipping on stone slick with condensation. A serpent struck from above, jaws opening just wide enough to engulf his head and shoulders. The bite wasn't frantic. It was surgical. The pressure was instantaneous, crushing, final. His body went limp before it hit the ground, dragged backward into darkness without resistance. The sound of it, bone compressing, breath expelled, cut through every other noise and anchored itself in my memory permanently. Weapons came up then. Training took over where reason failed. Shots rang out, deafening in the confused space. Muzzle flashes lit stone walls and writhing scales in stuttering bursts. Bullets struck home, sparks flaring where metal met armored hide, leaving shallow gouges that closed almost immediately. The serpents barely reacted. They absorbed impact, adjusted trajectory, continued forward with terrifying calm. Firepower meant nothing here. It never had. The jungle itself joined the execution. Trees toppled as if uprooted by invisible hands. Vines lashed outward, snagging gear, pulling men off their feet. The ground split in places, roots erupting upward like grasping limbs. I saw one teammate lifted bodily into the air by a massive coil that wrapped his torso and legs, crushing the scream out of him before it fully formed. His rifle clattered uselessly against stone as the serpent tightened once, efficiently, and released him lifeless to the floor. The coin fell from our leader's hand at some point, skidding across stone, coming to rest against the boundary line as if the chamber itself rejected it. But the damage was done. The seal had been broken. The island was no longer testing intent, it was reclaiming balance. We tried to retreat, abandoning any thought of extraction or proof. Every path collapsed behind us, roots sealing passages, stone shifting to block exits we had entered through minutes earlier. The serpents herded us rather than chased us, cutting off roots, forcing movement in specific directions. I realized then they weren't trying to kill us all at once. They were thinning us out, controlling flow, making examples. I saw patterns in the chaos. Those who dropped weapons, who froze or panicked, were taken quickly and cleanly. Those who fired blindly, who tried to fight the island on its own ground, were crushed with unmistakable finality. The message was brutal, but consistent. Resistance escalated consequence. At some point, the jungle canopy tore open above us as we burst back into the open, fleeing blindly through undergrowth that no longer tried to hide its hostility. The air was thick with debris and moisture, every breath burning. Lights failed one by one, swallowed by impacts or crushed under falling timber. The perimeter we had established earlier was gone, erased as if it had never existed. The island had no interest in preserving our footprints. Another man fell beside me, dragged sideways by something unseen, his hand slipping from my grip as I tried to pull him free. The strength on the other end was inexorable, patient. His fingers slid from mine, leaving streaks of blood and sweat across my glove. I never saw him again. I didn't hear him die. The silence afterward was worse than screams would have been. By then, coherent orders had dissolved into instinctive movement. Run, crawl, hide, breathe. The serpents moved through the jungle with complete spatial awareness, anticipating direction, cutting off escape routes before we committed to them. I understood with sick clarity that they knew this terrain not as land, but as extension of themselves. Every root, every slope, every shadow was part of a living system that had awakened fully. I don't remember making the choice that saved me. There was no heroic decision, no clever maneuver. There was only a moment when the chaos surged away from me, attention shifting toward louder resistance elsewhere. A corridor opened briefly between fallen trees and thrashing coils, not empty but unoccupied. I moved into it without thinking, crawling through mud and splintered wood, pressing myself flat as massive bodies slid past close enough for me to feel displaced air ripple across my skin. I lay there, motionless, breath shallow, heart pounding so hard I was certain it would give me away. A serpent passed overhead, belly scales brushing leaves inches from my face. I could smell it then, earth, old leather, something metallic and ancient. It paused, head lowering slightly, eyes catching the faint reflection of my goggles. For a suspended moment, I knew I was seen. Nothing happened. The serpent moved on. That was when the truth settled in, cold and heavy. They weren't missing me. They were sparing me. The slaughter continued around me, methodical and restrained until there were no more sounds of resistance. No gunfire, no shouting, just the creak of settling trees and the slow, controlled movement of something immense returning to rest. The island exhaled, tension bleeding away as equilibrium restored. When I finally dared to move again, dawn was breaking weakly through torn canopy. The jungle looked wounded but calm, debris already settling into new patterns that erased signs of conflict. Bodies were gone, not hidden, not scattered, simply removed as efficiently as artifacts returned to their places. I stood alone amid flattened ground and broken roots, the last unresolved variable in a corrected equation. I staggered toward the shoreline on instinct alone, guided by sound and fading light. The serpents did not follow. They didn't need to. The island had made its point. There was no triumph in my survival, no sense of victory. Only the crushing realization that mercy had been extended deliberately, and that I would have to live with that knowledge far longer than any of the men who hadn't been given the choice. I escaped only because the island allowed it, and that truth haunts me more than the deaths. The dead were never listed as dead. They were filed away. They flew me out before the shock wore off. No ceremony, no debrief on the beach, no questions about what I'd seen. The extraction team treated me like contaminated cargo, gloves on, eyes averted, instructions delivered through masks and clipped hand signals. I remember the sound of the rotors more than anything else, how they tore the air apart, how familiar noise felt obscene after the island's deliberate quiet. As Snake Island shrank beneath us, I expected relief. What I felt instead was a tightening, like a cord being drawn around something unfinished. At base, the lights were too bright, the floors too clean. The smell of disinfectant burned my nose, erasing the jungle's damp rot and replacing it with something sterile and dishonest. Medical cleared me in under an hour. No psych eval, no prolonged observation. They weren't concerned with my condition, they were concerned with containment. I was escorted straight from the infirmary to a windowless room I hadn't seen before, walls bare except for a mounted camera that didn't blink. The officer waiting for me wasn't the one from the initial briefing. This man wore civilian clothes and carried no visible insignia, but his authority was unmistakable. He spoke softly, like someone explaining a procedure rather than a death. The after-action report was already written when they slid it across the table. 7 pages. Thorough. Clean. Wrong. Our insertion time was incorrect. Our route was altered. Our objective reframed as routine reconnaissance interrupted by mechanical failure. Casualties were listed under a single phrase repeated with bureaucratic efficiency. Lost at sea. No locations. No causes. No remains. The words stared back at me, flat and unmovable. I felt something inside me strain against them, a need to correct, to scream, to drag those men back into language where they belonged. But I said nothing. Silence had already been chosen on my behalf. I asked about the artifacts. The question escaped before I could stop it. The civilian's expression didn't change. "Recovered materials are being handled through appropriate channels," he said. That sentence meant nothing and everything. I knew what appropriate channels looked like. Secured vaults beneath bases no one acknowledged. Basements where history went to be sorted into acceptable and unacceptable categories. Anything that didn't fit doctrine got buried deeper than Snake Island ever was. They played me audio next. Intercepted transmissions. Mine. Team chatter. Commands spoken in moments of panic. The recordings had been edited, pauses stretched, replies removed. Context stripped until the voices sounded confused, unprofessional, unreliable. It was character assassination through omission. I understood then that the report wasn't meant to record events. It was meant to discredit any deviation from it before it could surface. "You'll sign," the civilian said, "not as a threat, but as a fact. And you'll forget." I laughed then. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity broke something open. Forgetting wasn't possible. The island had carved itself into me, into the way I breathed, the way silence pressed on my ears at night. The civilian let me finish, then leaned forward just enough to ensure I understood what came next. "If you speak," he continued, "you won't be corrected. You won't be reprimanded. You'll be reclassified." He didn't explain what that meant. He didn't need to. I'd seen files marked that way. Careers erased. Records altered. Families told their loved ones suffered breakdowns, made mistakes, couldn't be trusted. People don't disappear anymore. They're disassembled. I signed. They reassigned me within the week. Desk duty. Coastal analysis. No fieldwork. No water deployments. My gear was confiscated for inspection and never returned. Personal logs wiped. Server access restricted. I became a ghost in my own unit, present but carefully ignored. The men who'd known me avoided eye contact, not out of suspicion but fear. Fear is contagious in institutions built on order. At night, I dreamed of coils moving through paper. Stacks of reports twisting together, tightening around names and dates until nothing readable remained. I woke drenched in sweat, heart racing, listening for sounds that weren't there. Scale against bark. Roots shifting stone. None came. The island didn't follow me. But its absence felt deliberate, like distance granted rather than achieved. Weeks later, I was called in again. This time to witness a briefing, not participate. One screen showed satellite imagery of the region around Snake Island. Cloud cover heavy, signal distortion noted. Nothing abnormal. Another screen displayed inventory forms redacted almost entirely in black. The civilian stood beside me, hands folded. "As far as the record is concerned," he said, "nothing of value was found." I didn't respond. What value means depends entirely on who's asking. I thought of the chamber beneath the roots, the careful arrangement, The test embedded in stone and consequence. Command had failed it as predictably as every empire before them. The only difference was scale. They wouldn't loot the island directly. They'd extract fragments, study them, weaponize understanding if possible. They would call it progress. I requested leave shortly after. Approved without hesitation. They wanted me away from the system, distant, quiet. I traveled inland, as far from salt water as I could manage. But the sea followed me anyway in memory. In harbors, I watched ships depart and wondered which ones would never return. Their absence eventually smoothed over by paperwork and time. I listened to old sailors talk, half drunk, half remembering, and noted how often their stories skirted around unnamed places, stretches of water avoided without explanation. The pattern was older than me, older than my service. I understood then that Snake Island wasn't unique. It was simply honest. Other places hid behind storms or ice or radiation. This one hid behind restraint. It waited to be approached, then revealed exactly as much as a person deserved to see. And when the lesson was ignored, it enforced it without cruelty or malice. Only balance. The official narrative held. No inquiries. No leaks. The families of the lost were given folded flags and sympathetic phrases. None were told where their sons had actually gone. None would ever hear the truth unless someone broke the silence deliberately constructed around it. And that silence weighed heavier on me than any threat issued in that windowless room. Years passed. The war moved on. New operations, new theaters, new myths quietly born beneath modern language. But sometimes, late at night, I caught myself drawing spirals absent-mindedly on scrap paper, fingers tracing paths my mind couldn't forget. I stopped reading after-action reports closely. They all sounded the same once you learned what absence looked like on the page. I was warned never to speak of Snake Island again. And I didn't. Not aloud. Not officially. But silence isn't the same as forgetting. It's just another form of waiting. But stories don't die when they're buried. They coil and wait. Some coordinates never make it onto charts, but the sea remembers them anyway. Years passed before I could speak about water again without feeling my chest tighten. The reassignment ended quietly, like most things meant to disappear. I left the service with a handshake that felt rehearsed and a file thinner than my actual history. The world moved on the way it always does. Wars rebranded, threats renamed, lessons politely ignored. I tried to do the same. I took inland work for a while. Analysis jobs far from harbors and hulls, telling myself distance would dull memory. It didn't. Memory doesn't fade when it's anchored to understanding. I started hearing rumors the way sailors always have, indirectly, through fragments and tone rather than facts. A trawler that lost power in calm seas for no mechanical reason. A container ship that drifted off course despite functioning navigation, crew reporting shadows pacing beneath the waves, matching speed without surfacing. A patrol boat whose radar returned false echoes in an empty stretch of ocean, contacts circling patiently before vanishing. These stories never reached official briefings. They circulated in mess halls, docks, and late-night bars where men spoke softly and laughed afterward to pretend they weren't afraid. The location was never named, but it didn't need to be. I recognized the shape of the silence around it. What struck me wasn't that incidents continued. It was that nothing escalated. No attacks, no sinkings, no wreckage washing ashore. The sea simply disrupted, corrected, redirected. Vessels that strayed too close found reasons to turn back. Electrical failures resolved once distance was restored. Compasses stabilized when bows pointed away. That pattern mattered. It wasn't punishment. It was guidance enforced without explanation. I returned to the coast years later for a conference, My first time near open water since the island. As I stood on the pier watching ships move through haze, I felt it again, not fear, but awareness. The ocean isn't empty. It's layered with memory, with roots traced and retraced until they become instinct, even to those who don't know why they avoid certain waters. The old fishermen understood this. They always have. They don't need charts to tell them where not to go. They read absence the way others read weather. One evening, an aging deckhand struck up a conversation with me. He talked the way men do when they sense shared understanding without knowing its source. He mentioned a stretch of sea he refused to cross anymore. Called it bad luck territory, said engines acted strange there, like they were being listened to. He laughed it off, but his hands shook slightly when he lit his cigarette. I didn't ask where it was. I didn't need to. He changed the subject quickly, as if afraid even casual acknowledgement might draw attention. That was when I realized the island habul hadn't vanished. It had integrated. It no longer needed to reveal itself through bones and warnings nailed to trees. The lesson had propagated outward, carried by rumor, malfunction, instinct. A soft perimeter enforced not by walls or firepower, but by memory. Every ship that turned back reinforced it. Every story told in half sentences kept it intact. I thought often about the chamber beneath the roots. The careful arrangement. The boundary line etched into stone. That place wasn't built to protect gold. It was built to expose something persistent in us. The belief that discovery grants ownership. That arriving first or arriving armed rewrites obligation. War amplifies that belief. It trains us to see land as objective, resources as advantage, silence as opportunity. The island had seen that logic come and go across centuries, wearing different flags, speaking different languages, making the same mistake with increasing efficiency. The serpents made sense to me now. Not as monsters, not even as guardians in the way myths describe, but as instruments of balance. They didn't judge morality. They measured behavior, intent, action, consequence. They didn't pursue those who passed through respectfully. They responded to taking, to entitlement masquerading as progress. That distinction matters, even if modern thinking resists it. I sometimes wondered why I'd been spared. The question followed me through years of quiet routine, through nights where dreams returned me to coiled shadows and controlled silence. I no longer believed it was chance. The island didn't miss me. It chose me. The realization took time to accept. That survival can be a sentence rather than a gift. That being allowed to leave carries obligation heavier than any artifact. I began writing privately. Not reports, not testimony. Stories. Fragmented at first, then clearer. Not to expose specifics, but to preserve understanding. To remind myself that restraint is not weakness, that some victories are defined by what remains untouched. I never named the island in my notes. I didn't need to. Names invite claim. I let it remain what it was, present without designation. The sea, I learned, operates on long memory. It doesn't rush consequence. It waits until patterns repeat enough times to justify response. That patience is what humans misinterpret as absence. We assume silence means permission. The island corrected that assumption without cruelty, without malice, using only what was necessary to restore equilibrium. Now, when I stand near water, I listen differently. I don't look for threats. I look for boundaries, where currents shift unnaturally, where birds refuse to cross, where sound behaves strangely. These aren't anomalies. They're signals. A language older than sonar and satellite, still functioning despite our insistence that everything unexplained is temporary. I know command archived fragments of what we found. I know analysts pored over materials stripped of context, trying to extract utility from warning. That effort will fail the way it always does. You can't weaponize restraint. You can't monetize reminder without erasing its meaning. And even if someone manages to reach the chamber again, to take something and escape, the island will simply adjust. The sea will close ranks. The stories will thicken. The perimeter will hold. Because places like that don't exist to be defeated. They exist to persist. To wait until humanity is capable of encountering something without trying to own it. I don't know if that day will come. I only know that until it does, the island will keep watching, not actively, not angrily, but attentively. The way an elder watches a child repeat the same mistake, knowing correction will eventually teach what instruction never could. I no longer think of what we found there as treasure. That word belongs to markets and wars. What lay beneath those roots was a measure. A reminder etched into stone and scale that power doesn't equal entitlement and access doesn't erase obligation. The men I lost didn't die because the island was cruel. They died because we failed a test others had failed before us, dressed in the same confidence, convinced this time would be different. When ships pass safely now, when sailors choose longer routes without knowing why, when silence continues to hold where maps show nothing, that is the island at work. Not conquering, not expanding, just maintaining balance in a world that resists it at every turn. Some islands are not meant to be conquered. Some treasures are not rewards, but reminders. And the sea remembers every debt humanity refuses to acknowledge. This story is inspired by real wartime reports, blended with folklore and dramatized for narrative purposes.